Ukraine has launched a devastating attack on Russia's missile brigade, which were responsible for the strike on Sumy, on the city of Sumy, killing 35 people. How do you assess this retaliation from the Ukrainian side? And also, do you believe that Russian army will finally learn this lesson that it is really illegal and not appropriate to kill civilians in the war?
Well, there are two important things to unpack here. First of all, the ability of the Ukraine military to strike deep into Russia at strategic targets. This is something that is increasing and something the Ukraine military are doing very well. And it's not just with intelligence and equipment provided by the Americans and the West. Ukraine is developing its own military capabilities and getting its own intelligence as well. And this is something that is improving, increasing as days go by. And I think the Russians are realizing that they're becoming more and more vulnerable, in Russia itself. And this will be a huge concern because the air defense assets that they need to defend these key locations just don't exist any longer. And the very few that they have, Putin and his officials are using to protect themselves. So this is likely to become a bigger and bigger headache, for the Russians as they go forward, as Ukraine gets better and better and better at this. And it's key to cutting off the logistic tail, as it were, that supports the frontline troops. And I am sure that as these attacks continue, the Russian troops in the front lines are going to, perform, worse and worse. Whatever we think of President Putin, he's not an idiot. He's been the dictator for 25 years or so. So he must be pretty bright, and he must realize that this is happening and things are beginning to turn against him in a pretty severe way.
Also recently, Ukrainian army has repelled Russia's offensive full-scale attack in the south of Ukraine. Russia was using hundreds of soldiers, tanks and other armored vehicles. Do you feel that Russian army has already reached its culminating point? Because even this offensive in the south of Ukraine has failed, and Russia suffered another staggering casualties, enormous casualties.
I think that is largely the case. I think it's also the case that, Russia has tried to concentrate its forces, but to conduct tank warfare, or combined arms warfare, as we call it, takes a lot of training. When I trained my regiment to do this, it took over a year. The Russians are only taking days or weeks to try and train these forces. Therefore, they're just not effective. And now that the Ukraine army is well organized and has capabilities, it's been able to pick off these forces and prevent them making any ground. And I don't think there's any prospect in the future. There's lots of talk about Russia massing forces for some big attack, but that seems to be information coming out of Russia, not the reality. It occurs to me, or it's apparent to me, that Ukraine pretty much has a good intelligence picture of what the Russians are trying to do. And if they do try and amass a force because it's poorly trained, it's very unlikely to be effective and very likely to be taken down, as you've described recently with the attacks in the south.
Also, let's cover ceasefire talks. Another round of these discussions will take place in London this week. Also, according to Bloomberg, the United States is ready to recognize Russian control of the Ukrainian region of Crimea as a part of a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. What is your assessment of the current stage of ceasefire talks?
Well, it's very difficult to sort of unpick all the information coming from both sides. And no doubt, there's a lot of disinformation we know coming out of Russia, and there are a lot of confusing messages coming out of Washington. Now, no doubt the talks this week, or I think tomorrow in London, will be very important way of going forward. And very much, I expect, with the with Britain and France leading the way militarily. As you said, there seems to be messages coming out of Washington that maybe a part of the peace deal would be that America would recognize Crimea as part of Russia, which might be the one piece that America thinks that Ukraine can concede. What it doesn't talk about is conceding any of the four oblasts which Russia has illegally invaded since 2022. And that is very, very significant as well. So maybe it's the start of some sort of negotiation deal. The Americans have also said, which the Russians seem to be keen on, that Ukraine could not join NATO in the foreseeable future. And I think that is something that what one sort of expected. And the Americans have also said there may be ways round providing Ukraine defense security without being members of NATO. Yeah, it strikes me as a military person, actually, if Ukraine became a member of the European community and the European Defence Force, then that would be a pretty good sort of defensive network to be part of, just short of being part of NATO. So lots been talked at the moment. I think a lot is happening this week. And I think by the end of the week, we'll have a much better flavour of where exactly everybody is. But I think it's far from all in the Russian court and the Russian moving forward. I think actually that hopefully by the end of the week, we'll be in a position where the Ukrainians have the full support of the Americans, as they already do, all the European countries, and will be in a strong position to start any peace and ceasefire negotiations with the Russians. Conversely, I think things are stacking up against Putin, and it's very difficult to see where he can go from here, except for around the negotiation table for peace. And if Crimea is the cost of that, then only the Ukraine people will judge whether that's something that they are prepared to discuss.
It is interesting that Russians are demanding also, would like to see United States recognizing control over the four regions of Ukraine. As you just mentioned, Vladimir Putin would like to see the US to recognize occupied territories as Russian territories. However, we haven't heard and we haven't read any kind of reports that could suggest that the United States was ready to do so. Does it mean that the American team, Trump's administration, is not ready to give Vladimir Putin all what he really wants?
Well, it's very difficult to say without being part of that team. They do sort of change their view quite regularly, and it can be quite confusing. But I think it is telling that what we have heard is the no NATO point, which I think we were all expecting. And we have heard the Americans talk about Crimea. I suppose it's equally important that we haven't heard them talk about the four occupied oblasts. And, I expect that is of more concern in the Kremlin than it is in Kyiv and Western capitals. But really, until we see the next round of negotiations and until we see what's coming out of the White House this week, it's difficult to tell because things have been so confusing, and it would appear the Americans themselves are having some difficulties. The Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, seems to be in some sort of bother, and we're not sure whether he'll still be in his post at the end of this week. But Trump has said that he expects a peace deal to be signed this week, and let's hope he puts his full effort behind making that a reality.
And also, let's also cover UK's nuclear deterrent. You just mentioned in your article for The Telegraph that the UK should start to produce also tactical nuclear weapons. Do you see the tactical nukes as the best option for the United Kingdom to deter Russia and to retaliate in case of attack?
Well, I think it's certainly something that Britain must consider, and we have a strategic defence review that is due to report very soon, and I hope they've considered it. because if America is going to get less involved in Europe, then the nuclear equilibrium, if you like, goes very much in favor of the Russians. It would leave just two nuclear countries in Europe, Britain and France. And although far smaller than the Russians know that there are enough strategic ballistic missiles to create, very severe damage on Russia. However, what is in complete imbalance is the tactical nuclear weapons. Britain gave up its tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons back in 1998. And although France has a few, there is a dilemma now that if Russia used a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine or maybe in the Baltic states, how Britain would respond. I think it's highly unlikely. In fact, I don't think Britain would respond with a strategic nuclear weapon. That there is very little we could do. And I think that is probably the assumption President Putin is making. However, if Britain and France had tactical nuclear weapons to be able to counter the Russians, I think that balance would be back more in equilibrium and the Russians more easily use it. I think the final piece on this, the tactical nuclear weapons are a way to generate masses of force on the local battlefield, far more than hundreds of tanks and everything else. And if you can use them with impunity, then Putin might consider it worth it. And there is a possibility that could happen. So I would hope that Britain considers this and certainly gives something for Putin to think about, that actually it might be a sensible thing for Britain to re-establish its tactical nuclear weapon capability in order that Russia cannot use its tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine or in Europe in general.
Is the United Kingdom capable of producing new tactical nuclear weapons?
Well, that is a very good question, and probably one that one can't answer definitively. But Britain has a long history in developing nuclear capability. There is the Atomic Weapons Establishment, where Britain's nuclear weapons are maintained and developed. So I wouldn't have thought with my own expertise that would be an insurmountable problem. And Britain still has capabilities like the F-35B fighter and has hypersonic missiles that these weapons could be put on. So it's not it's not an easy task. I would accept that, but I'm sure if Britain put its mind to it, it could produce the capability fairly quickly.
And you're confident that tactical nuclear weapons can beat Russia's mass on the battlefield in case of a global conflict, and could be the best option to retaliate if Russia attacks NATO or Ukraine with nuclear weapons, or if attacks NATO, for example, with conventional weapons?
Well, I think the key thing about nuclear weapons is the term mutually assured destruction. And the reason that we've not had global conflict since the end of the Second World War is because both the Russians and the West have had balanced nuclear weapon capability. But when it comes to tactical nuclear weapons, this is unbalanced, especially if the Americans are going to step back from supporting Europe. That's why I think it is something that Britain and France should consider, just so that there is a balance in tactical nuclear weapons, in the same way that we haven't used strategic weapons because they're balanced. I think it would make sure that the Russians didn't use their tactical nuclear weapons. So I don't see at all there'd be any first strike options by the United Kingdom. In other words, firing a tactical nuclear missile first. The key thing is to prevent the Russians from using their own weapons. That's why I think we potentially need to review our holdings of nuclear weapons and possibly looking at redeveloping our tactical or battlefield nuclear capability.
And do you feel that the United Kingdom is ready to replace the United States in providing nuclear umbrella for other European countries?
Well, certainly the French government, President Macron, has already said that that is what France will do. I think Britain and France are really working very, very closely at the moment. And although that hasn't been stated, I think it's inferred that, between Britain and France, they would provide a nuclear umbrella, a nuclear safety net, as you were, for Europe if the Americans are going to withdraw from that commitment.
And let's cover our final topic. You mentioned about the Pete Hegseth, U.S. Defense Secretary. According to CNN, Pete Hegseth also shared war plans about military operations against Houthis on a second Signal chat group. This one was on his personal phone, and this group included his wife, lawyer, and brother, according to CNN sources. What is your assessment of such a national security failure?
Well, I think it's very serious indeed. The original intelligence failure on the Signal channel, where not only multiple people, but also a journalist was copied into what was happening on some key targeting information. That was a very serious breach. So for it to happen again, I think is probably unforgivable. I can't imagine if something like this happened to members of the British government that they would still be in position. And I think also the approach of some American politicians appearing to be rather too close to the Russians in the last few months is a concern as well. I think everybody, including myself, suggested that Pete Hegseth was rather underqualified and inexperienced to hold such an important job. And these two serious intelligence gaffes have sort of underlined that particular case. And you would have thought that America could come up with somebody who is more experienced, more qualified, with a safer pair of hands, as it were, to run the American military than perhaps Pete Hegseth, who has slipped on two very, very dangerous banana skins. And, the potential for even worse to happen is absolutely there. So you would hope that President Trump realizes this and acts accordingly.
And could this development reduce intelligence sharing between American allies, between the United States and also European allies? Do you feel that European allies would be even more not ready to share all intelligence information with American colleagues, American counterparts?
Well, I think there are two levels to this. That we call the working level, so sharing of intelligence between the CIA and the special intelligence services of the UK and France and Ukraine. I think that still operates very well, and that is very secure. When it comes to politicians, and of course politicians are not necessarily privy to all the intelligence, just the intelligence that they need to know. I think sharing between politicians and perhaps some government agencies might well be affected by this, and people will be more circumspect. But I think at the operational level, and particularly involved with the fighting in Ukraine, I'm sure that will be unaffected by any gaffes by senior politicians in the US at the moment.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me. Glory to Ukraine.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.